I was trying to think whether or not it was terrifying or a huge honor to come last after such a wonderful set of speakers. So before I started, I just wanted to take a minute to thank my fellow speakers for being so provocative and fabulous today and putting me in such an uncomfortable position. So thank you all very, very much. I'm here today to talk about an issue that we here in Canada do not have the privilege of discussing we have the privilege, I should say, of not discussing very often, and that is our democracy. I'm pretty sure, judging by the level of the discussion outside, that this is a pretty well-read crowd. So I'm just curious where you think that Canada ranks on the Economist 2011 Global Democracy Index. Just guess. Don't be afraid, there's no...
Top 10.
Somewhere in the 20s.
Okay. There's no clock. I'm not giving you a clock, so there's nothing to be gained or lost. Well, Jay Treadway, there would be a clock for you. We're 8th. Now, what about Transparency International's annual index that they produce? Just guess. It's just a game. 50?
8.
8? You'd win the clock, kind of. We're 10th. And Freedom House. We're free. That basically means perfect in their parlance. So top of the pile again, and I think you get the picture. But I guess the question I want to ask us to think about is how we square that with the sense that many of us have that things here in Canada aren't working quite as well as they could. We know that voter turnout, for example, has been on almost a very steady decline for well over a generation, and millions of dollars of advertising has done very little to stem or reverse that tide. Recent public opinion produced by research done by the University of British Columbia is equally troubling. 62% of Canadians said that they believe Canadian democracy to be in crisis. 52% agreed that none of the federal political parties had a satisfactory position on the issue that mattered most to them. And a whopping 75% said they were very disappointed with the quality of leadership in all of our federal political parties. So I hope I am not alone in believing that we can do a little better. A few years ago, I co-founded an organization called Samara, and so I have to say it is a real pleasure and honor to follow Nate, because I think we are probably few among not many Ridley grads who've actually gone on to try to experiment with starting a nonprofit organization, and as you said, it isn't always easy. But Samara is a word that is taken from the official name for that helicopter seed that comes down from the maple tree. And at Samara, we're working to figure out how to reconnect citizens to politics, and in doing so, encourage greater leadership and participation in the public life of our country. Canada faces a great number of challenges in the 21st century, from environmental sustainability, economic productivity, healthcare delivery, to name but a few. And of course, Ian in his opening presentation touched on many others. There are lots of ways to influence these issues, but much of how we approach them still is a direct result of decisions that our governments and their leaders make. And so making sure that these decisions are done properly is really important to ensuring that Canada continues to have a high quality of life. In other countries, of course, as we know, citizens risk their lives to live in a society where they have a voice in their government. And here, we just keep taking our democracy for granted. Voting trends are really one indicator among many, and we know that Canadians are increasingly just checking out of their democracy full stop. And the sad irony of this behavior is that it reinforces the reality that nobody actually wants to be a Canadian leader. Trends suggest that young men and women who are graduating from schools like Ridley today want to go on into broad categories of employ like business. They want to be leaders on Bay Street, or they want to start a company, or maybe they want to practice medicine, or maybe they want to work in a non-governmental organization. These are all great and important things, to be sure. But these students do not aspire to lead their cities, their provinces, or their country, and they're not alone. I'm not kidding. Turns out that even those elected officials who we task to run the country never set out to be leaders, or at least that's what they told us. Over at Samara, we started our work about 4.5 years ago by conducting Canada's first ever series of exit interviews with now 80 former members of Parliament from all political parties and all across the country. Now, exit interviews are very common in most organizations, but they had never been done before in what I would argue is one of the most important workplaces in this country, and that is our Parliament. We shared their stories in a series of reports, which if you're so inclined, you can find on the internet, and they'll be published in a book next spring. But all in all, it's been a really fascinating opportunity to peek behind that curtain and understand how politics works on the front lines. Some of what we were told was really inspiring. Great examples of how an entrepreneurial, passionate Canadian can make a huge difference through politics. For example, one of the favorite MPs I met was a man named David Anderson. He was an Olympic rower, he was a lawyer, a junior diplomat when he ran for Parliament in the late 1960s and was elected as an MP at 29 years old. A couple years later, he founded Canada's first ever Environment Committee and gave national attention to those issues for the very first time. There was also a story that came from a group of MPs, all who had universities in their ridings, and in the wake of some very serious budget cuts in the 1990s, rallied together and created a series of federal grants that have now enabled Canadian universities to recruit some of the very best professors from around the world and launch all kinds of innovative research right here in Canada. The diversity of people who comprise our elected officials was also a surprise to me, a far cry from the lawyers and kind of political hacks that I had anticipated. I'm reluctant to give you another game, but I was going to ask you to guess what the most common pre-parliamentary profession was. And it's interesting because we're in a school and it's actually teaching. But before MPs came to politics, they were actually all kinds of things. They're lawyers, of course, there, but business executives, government managers, clergymen, electricians, social workers, cooks, academics, police officers, engineers, all kinds of things. This means that there isn't a political class in our country. You don't have to be a millionaire or have gone to particular schools to be part of our leadership cadre. Canadian and MPs really do have very diverse and interesting backgrounds. So I guess the next question is, why do they choose to become politicians? This is one of the questions that we ask them, and here's where things get a little bit more troubling. It seems that very few people who become political leaders in this country said that they actually wanted the job in the first place. Sometimes when I watch politics on TV, I don't blame them. Almost without exception, MPs describe themselves as outsiders who were cajoled into running for office. Almost every single former MP to whom we spoke said they didn't stand up and ask to run for office. Rather, it wasn't until somebody asked them that they were to run that they said that they even considered it. We heard numerous stories from former MPs, including Prime Minister Paul Martin, talking about how they had turned down requests to run numerous times before finally agreeing, often begrudgingly, to take a shot. In one case, one MP's neighbor came back, he said, every day for a week until they got the answer that he wanted. Now, of course, we've got to keep in mind that these are stories coming from former politicians who probably don't want to come off as too ambitious. In fact, many of the MPs we interviewed went out of their way to tell us how unambitious they actually were, as if ambition were some kind of crippling affliction. But whatever the case, whether our politicians have no ambition, or what I think is probably more likely, that they were embarrassed to admit that they suffered from a case of ambition, I really left myself asking, what would have happened if they hadn't been asked to run? Would they seriously have just opted out? And second, and perhaps more important for our musings, what is the problem with ambition in democratic life? We are encouraged to be ambitious in all kinds of pursuits, in business, the arts, science. Why is public service so different? What I think these MPs are probably actually reflecting is the very sad truth that a politician who actually aspires to lead is frankly unelectable in this country. I think there is something wrong with politics if you're not allowed to say that you want to be a political leader. And there's something really wrong with the job if the only way to get people to do it is by some kind of mild coercion. Given the stakes, this is a problem. And really that is just the beginning. When MPs arrived in Ottawa, they told us they were struck with two really powerful emotions. The first was this huge sense of pride and responsibility that came with the job, particularly, many said, when they walked up the stairs of Parliament Hill for the very first time. The second was the realization that they felt completely and utterly unprepared for the job. For lack of a better term, they went to Ottawa and they were forced to wing it. And this isn't their fault entirely. After they're elected, they have about 2 weeks to set up and staff 2 offices, one in Ottawa, one in their home riding. On average, MPs come to Ottawa in their late 40s, so they've spent about 25 years doing something entirely different, raising a family, building a career, usually in a city that's pretty far away from Ottawa. But when they arrive, there is little formal training, hardly any orientation, there's no manual, there isn't even a job description. In fact, few of the MPs we interviewed actually agreed on what the essential purpose of a Member of Parliament actually is. And the group we spoke to had been in the job on average for about 10.5 years. From the 80 people that we have spoken to, we had about 40 different definitions of what the essential purpose of a Member of Parliament is supposed to be. Often it was a nuance and a difference in emphasis among representing constituents, making laws for the good of the country, and representing one's political party. Many compared it to other jobs, but often they were jobs that had nothing in common with each other. For example, being an MP was compared to being a teacher, not surprising, as many of them were, an administrator, a doctor, a lobbyist, a small business owner, a relationship counselor. One MP described the job as something that useful, intelligent people do to have a good time, which actually I thought wasn't bad. Another equated it to being a guard dog, so I guess you cannot blame all of us for being a little confused. So our MPs might diverge on how they describe the work, but what about that actual work, where that job intersects with crafting the policies and tackling those problems that we know our countries and communities are facing? After spending a couple of years of sifting through these exit interviews, a picture emerges of a democracy that happens almost as if by chance. And I think that is because we allow so much of the process to happen by chance. There's that accidental politician who needs to be asked or coerced into running. There's their haphazard approach when they arrive in Ottawa after their election. And many MPs told us that their committee and other assignments are allocated to them in a way that appears almost random, taking in almost no consideration for their prior experiences or skills. And I haven't even touched on the work in the House of Commons itself, which many MPs described as theatre, as embarrassing, and some even said was a complete waste of time. When we asked them to describe why, if these frustrations were so wide-felt, things didn't change, they pointed their finger, to me at any way, what was a very unexpected direction, and that was to their very own political parties. I thought this was kind of weird, because if MPs, who I would have thought are the very stalwarts of parties, their names are on the sign and all that kind of thing, if they don't like how parties are operating, I guess we can't be surprised when less than 1% of Canadians are members of these organizations. Now, I know this story is a bit worrisome, but I remain very hopeful. Because throughout all these stories, as I mentioned, there are ample examples of how our democratic system still can be very responsive to its citizens, but only if we are willing to participate in it and nudge it in the direction that it needs to go. So our mission at Samara is over time to help encourage citizens to do just that. Politics, I believe, is ultimately about service to one's community, to one's country, and I think it's fitting that we talk a bit about what we can do as a school whose motto, by the way, Terra Dum Prosum, asks us to put service at the very center of our lives. So I thought I would share just a couple of ideas. First, seeing that this is a school, I thought we could start with education. To paraphrase Plato, those who think they are too smart to engage in politics are punished by being governed by those who are dumber. And that doesn't include the teachers here, of course. So we have a choice. We can try to encourage the next generation to engage in our democracy, or we can try to educate those folks who are dumber. Seeing as the former is probably slightly more pragmatic, I thought we could start there. Canadian students need to understand how our democratic system works. They need to know how Canada's democratic leadership works. And when it seems like it isn't working, they need to understand why. Some of the work we've done has been turned into materials for high schools and for universities. But our goal is wider than that, and it is to contribute to a broader understanding of democratic leadership in Canada for both its strengths and, frankly, its many weaknesses, so that we can change the way that leadership is understood and pursued. We know that Canadians are fed up with their leaders, and they're tuning out. And that is especially strong in the generation that is in schools today. But Canada's disenchantment with government can only change when Canadians understand how the system works and why their political leaders are not behaving as they'd like them to, and what they can do to change that. So my hope is that the beginnings of some of this will start to change, will make its way in one form or another and start to change the ethos and the culture with which we approach politics in this country over time. Because if we don't start talking to kids about how they can be active democratic citizens, in counter to advertising that tells them, of course, how they can be really active and fantastic consumers, we have very little chance of revitalizing democratic leadership in this country. There's a second and related point, and I took this picture yesterday on the street of Toronto. I was shocked when I saw it. But it's about ambition, and I think we have to embrace that taboo. We have to nurture the desire to be a democratic leader in ourselves and our friends, our students and our children. I find the explaining away and denial around aspiration for political leadership very disconcerting, because implicit in it, of course, is the sense that there's some kind of shame in wanting to be active in our communities and in our democracy. And I think the MPs themselves perpetuate this. Instead of claiming that they didn't want to run, why didn't more of them say, you know, I believe that politics is a great way to make a contribution, and I had my eyes open for an opportunity. That shouldn't be a controversial statement. So all in all, I think we need to get over our ambition anxieties. And finally, I think we have to redefine what it means to be a participant in our democracy. We have to remember that change can also come from the inside. We are propagating a big myth that to be effective, you have to be outside government, and it's much easier somehow to do it that way. But if you do care about public problems, and we have to remember that it is through our democracy that we still decide how we're going to tackle those most of the way, and how we are going to live together. And if we don't engage in that, I do really worry about our effectiveness of being able to tackle those things in the future. So part of that means that we need to know that Ottawa or our provincial legislatures or our city halls, a career in politics or public service is a good possibility. But regardless of whether people choose to pursue it or not, we need to cultivate political citizens. People who are willing to connect to our political system, use the democratic mechanisms that have evolved successfully over many years to seek change from within. We need Canadians who truly understand and want to be leaders in our democratic system so that at the end of the day, they can help ensure that Canada remains a place that we are all very proud to call home. So as we say here at Ridley, terrar dum prosum, may I be consumed in service. Thank you.